Tiffany Henyard's tenure as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, quickly descended into chaos, marked by corruption allegations, financial mismanagement, and growing public outrage. Elected with promises of reform, her leadership soon became defined by poor decisions, scandals, and a lack of effective governance, leaving residents questioning her ability to lead. Henyard's rise to power was unconventional. Following the sudden death of Mayor Frank Zuccarelli, the Dalton Board of Trustees, under pressure to find a successor, appointed Henyard, a little-known figure, without much consultation. This rushed appointment raised suspicions that her selection was more about political maneuvering than merit, setting the stage for the controversies that followed. From the outset, Henyard's leadership seemed out of step with the needs of Dalton, and her decisions quickly fueled skepticism among the community. One of her first controversial moves was hiring a criminal inspector without consulting the Board of Trustees, a decision that alarmed many and highlighted her disregard for proper governance. Furthermore, Henyard enlisted Dalton police officers for personal security, blurring the lines between public office and private life, and raising concerns about conflict of interest. These early missteps added to the growing sense that Henyard's leadership was less about serving the public and more about consolidating power for personal gain. Despite promising greater civic engagement during her campaign, Henyard failed to address key issues facing Dalton, including a rejected mental health tax proposal. Her inability to effectively engage the community and address their concerns led to growing frustration among residents, with some of her early supporters openly criticizing her leadership. The lack of cooperation between Henyard and other officials created a hostile work environment, making it clear that her administration was becoming increasingly unstable. Henyard's leadership style was marked by an authoritarian approach, with little regard for collaboration or communication with town officials. She dismissed key figures such as Jessica Jones and Stephanie Whitman, leading many to believe that her decisions were politically motivated rather than based on merit. Her interactions with other officials grew more erratic, culminating in a disturbing incident where she allegedly locked Township Assessor Cass Sanderstone out of her office during a heated dispute. This incident, along with others, raised serious concerns about Henyard's ability to manage the town's affairs and protect the privacy of Dalton's residents. The situation worsened when Stone and another official discovered piles of confidential documents containing sensitive personal information of Dalton residents carelessly scattered in a common area outside Henyard's office. This mishandling of private information further eroded trust in Henyard's ability to govern responsibly, highlighting her failure to protect the town's citizens and their privacy. As Henyard's political career continued to spiral, allegations of corruption and financial mismanagement surfaced, with claims that she was using her position for personal gain. Despite the growing legal and investigative pressures, Henyard refused to step down, claiming that she was a victim of a political conspiracy aimed at undermining her leadership. However, many in Dalton were unconvinced by her defiant attitude, and public dissatisfaction with her leadership grew. The FBI soon launched investigations into Henyard's financial dealings, with rumors of embezzlement and misuse of public funds circulating. Her approval ratings plummeted, and public trust in her leadership all but evaporated. To make matters worse, another scandal emerged involving the sudden relocation of the assessor's office. Henyard dismissed concerns, claiming the move was necessary due to heat impairing her ability to work. But critics were unconvinced, particularly given the lack of official documentation or a formal announcement justifying the decision. Despite mounting backlash, Henyard continued to defend her actions, framing the relocation as part of a broader effort to prioritize citizen services. Her critics, however, saw this justification as weak and insincere, particularly as dissatisfaction with her leadership continued to grow. Even some of her supporters began voicing criticism, with one suggesting that local media should shift focus away from Dalton's management issues and instead highlight the town's receipt of funding. However, the political storm surrounding her only intensified, leaving Dalton's future uncertain. Henyard's controversial tenure as mayor of Dalton became a turbulent saga marked by scandal after scandal. Once a promising figure with promises of reform, Henyard's leadership was ultimately defined by poor decision-making, financial mismanagement, and a toxic work environment. As public dissatisfaction with her administration mounted, so did the legal challenges against her, further weakening her position. Her rise to power, once seen as an opportunity for change, quickly devolved into a chaotic period of political maneuvering, financial mismanagement, and growing mistrust. The lack of transparency, poor decision-making, and failure to protect the town's residents have left Dalton in a state of turmoil, with Henyard's political career hanging in the balance. As the investigation into her actions continues, the people of Dalton are left to wonder whether her scandal-ridden tenure will mark the end of her political career, or she will somehow manage to weather the storm and retain her grip on power in the end. Henyard's leadership serves as a cautionary tale of how a lack of accountability, poor governance. And unchecked ambition can lead to the downfall of a once promising political career and the destruction of public trust in leadership. As Dalton continues to grapple with the fallout from Henyard's tenure, it remains to be seen whether the town can recover from the chaos and rebuild the trust and stability it once enjoyed. Tiffany Henyard's leadership as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, devolved into a chaotic saga marked by dysfunction, public frustration, and mounting legal challenges. Once seen as a potential force for progress, her tenure quickly became defined by poor decision-making, a lack of transparency, and an inability to meet the expectations of the very community that had placed its trust in her. Henyard's rise to power was marked by controversy. Following the sudden death of Mayor Frank Zuccarelli, Henyard was appointed to position, but questions about the legitimacy of her selection quickly arose. As public scrutiny grew, Henyard's responses became increasingly defensive and combative, isolating her from the very community she was supposed to serve. Rather than engaging with the people of Dalton or taking responsibility for her failures, she adopted a more evasive and hostile stance. Further alienating residents, her approval ratings plummeted as Henyard restricted media access, holding private meetings where reporters were often cut off before they could ask critical questions. This deliberate avoidance of accountability left many residents frustrated and disillusioned. Henyard's most vocal defender, Keith Freeman, attempted to downplay the media criticism, dismissing it as gossip and rumors. He reassured the public by claiming that no private documents had been mishandled during the controversial relocation of the assessor's office. However, these reassurances did little to calm growing concerns about her leadership. The relocation of the assessor's office, initially framed as a move to enhance citizen services, became emblematic of the broader issues facing Henyard's administration: poor decision-making, lack of transparency, and a disregard for public input. As Henyard continued to defend her actions, her explanations grew increasingly unconvincing. She began to frame her struggles as a moral test, using spiritual language that painted her as a victim of external forces. Her rhetoric, which seemed more suited to a religious sermon than political defense, alienated many residents who saw her failure to address the real problems facing Dalton as an excuse rather than an explanation. Henyard's combative responses reached new heights when a reporter revealed how her administration had repeatedly denied media access to important meetings. When confronted, she dismissed the concerns, accusing reporters of spreading fake news and failing to do proper research. Her refusal to engage constructively only deepened the divide between her and the people of Dalton. Instead of taking responsibility, Henyard framed herself as a victim in a spiritual battle, suggesting that God had placed her in power to endure hardship. Keith Freeman, continuing to defend her, claimed that she was the right person for the job, divinely chosen to overcome the challenges she faced. However, this attempt to paint her leadership as part of a higher plan further alienated the public, who felt that Henyard's rhetoric was a deflection from the real issues at hand. As the public's dissatisfaction with Henyard's leadership grew, her increasingly isolated stance only intensified. She framed her struggles as part of divine tests, portrayed her troubles as evidence of her righteous battle against external forces. This language, which alienated many residents, made it seem as though Henyard was out of touch with the town's needs. Her focus on spiritual warfare seemed to disconnect her from the pressing issues facing Dalton, leaving the community to wonder if her promises of reform and progress were ever meant to be fulfilled at a critical public meeting. Henyard's combative behavior escalated when a reporter confronted her about her administration's repeated attempts to restrict media access. Rather than addressing concern, Henyard accused the reporter of spreading fake news, further deepening the divide between her and the public. Her inability to engage with the media or take responsibility for her actions made it clear that her administration was in a state of dysfunction. Once seen as a promising political leader, Henyard's tenure had become synonymous with poor management, a lack of transparency, and a failure to address the community's most pressing issues. Her promises of civic engagement and reform have been abandoned in favor of defensive rhetoric and avoidance. Legal battles continue to pile up against her, further diminishing her credibility and weakening her political position. The situation in Dalton became increasingly bleak as investigations into Henyard's financial dealings and leadership practices deepened. With each new revelation, her grip on power weakened, leaving Dalton's residents wondering whether she could ever redeem herself or whether her leadership would lead to her swift downfall. Despite her defiant stance, public calls for accountability grew louder, and the people of Dalton were left to question whether Henyard could weather the storm or if her scandal-ridden tenure would finally mark the end of her political career. Her time as mayor had gone from a hopeful beginning to a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition, poor decision-making, and a leadership style that ultimately failed to serve the people of Dalton. What was once seen as an opportunity for reform now seemed destined for a tragic downfall. Henyard's legacy, which had the potential to be one of progress, was instead being written as one of scandal, public disappointment, and the erosion of trust in local government as the uncertainty surrounding her future continued to grow. It became clear that Henyard's tenure had left Dalton in turmoil. What should have been a period of growth and renewal for the town had instead become a saga of dysfunction and unmet expectations. The people of Dalton were left to pick up the pieces of a broken administration, wondering if the promise of change had been nothing more than an illusion. Tiffany Henyard's time as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, has become a testament to the dangers of power wielded without accountability, transparency, or the will to confront difficult truths. What began with promises of change and progress quickly spiraled into a cautionary tale of poor decision-making, financial mismanagement, and an utter disregard for responsible governance. Legal battles, allegations of financial misconduct, and growing public backlash have threatened to unravel her leadership and tarnish her legacy. One of the most significant legal battles contributing to Henyard's downfall was a lawsuit filed by a Dalton police officer who was part of Henyard's personal security detail. The officer accused Henyard of misusing city resources to provide security for herself, raising serious concerns about her financial stewardship and the misuse of taxpayer money. This accusation illuminated the potential abuse of power, especially considering Dalton's already fragile financial situation. The officer's lawsuit painted Henyard's actions as a misuse of public funds for her personal benefit, highlighting the deepening lack of trust in her leadership. The legal troubles did not stop there. Another lawsuit was filed by Dwayne Doctor, a former maintenance manager who claimed he was wrongfully terminated by Henyard. Doctor cited insubordination and poor performance, though he had been on unauthorized leave at the time. In addition to wrongful termination, Dr. S. suit also alleged violations of his First and 14th Amendment rights, underscoring Henyard's disregard for legal procedures and due process. These lawsuits, combined with a growing number of legal challenges, created a toxic political environment, one where fear and distrust replaced cooperation and accountability. As the legal turmoil mounted, federal investigators began to probe deeper into Henyard's financial dealings. Their investigation, which soon attracted significant media attention, uncovered troubling revelations about Henyard's lavish spending and financial mismanagement. Former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot was hired at a rate of $400 per hour to investigate Henyard's spending habits. One of the most notorious examples of Henyard's fiscal irresponsibility was a $26,000 trip to Las Vegas, paid for with taxpayer dollars. At a time when Dalton's finances were in dire straits, with many residents struggling, such an extravagant expenditure raised serious questions about Henyard's priorities and her ability to manage public resources effectively. In response to mounting criticism, Henyard attempted to deflect attention by claiming that the investigation into her spending was racially motivated. She argued that she was being unfairly targeted due to her identity as a black woman in power, framing the scrutiny as an attempt to undermine her leadership. However, many residents of Dalton saw her defense as an attempt to deflect responsibility for her misuse of public funds. They believed her racial arguments were an unconvincing shield to avoid accountability for her actions, which had placed the community's trust and resources in jeopardy. Henyard's absence from a Dalton Village Board of Trustees meeting only fueled suspicions about her leadership and deepened the divide between her administration and the community. As the investigation continued, residents grew increasingly frustrated with her refusal to acknowledge the mounting evidence of her misconduct. They were left wondering if their mayor could ever be held accountable for her actions, and whether her leadership would eventually collapse under the weight of her scandals. Federal investigators soon uncovered further troubling findings. Nearly $900,000 had been paid to a local prosecutor over the course of 2 years, despite the prosecutor's inability to generate any criminal charges. This raised serious questions about the potential corruption within Henyard's administration and whether taxpayer funds were being misused to benefit individuals close to her. The discovery of this questionable expenditure deepened the cloud of suspicion surrounding her leadership as the investigation progressed. The scope of the corruption seemed to extend beyond Henyard herself. Federal authorities turned their attention to her inner circle, including members of her political committee, her charity, and several trustees, 2 of whom were believed to be her relatives. Subpoenas were issued to these individuals, demanding records related to payroll data, expenses, employment reimbursements, credit card statements, travel details, and other financial transactions. The increasing number of subpoenas further deepened the suspicion that the corruption ran through multiple levels of Henyard's administration. With each new revelation, Dalton residents were left questioning whether their mayor would ever be held accountable for her actions, and whether her controversial tenure would mark the end of her political career. Henyard's leadership, once seen as a potential force of change, had descended into scandal and dysfunction. The community was left grappling with the aftermath of her mismanagement, legal battles, and growing distrust in their local government. Henyard's downfall serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of transparency and accountability in leadership. What was once a promising political career is now a cautionary tale of how ambition, when combined with a lack of ethical governance, can devastate a community. The people of Dalton have been left to deal with the consequences of Henyard's actions, and the town's future remains uncertain as investigations continue into the full scope of the corruption that defined her administration. As Henyard's political career unravels, the people of Dalton are left wondering if there will ever be justice for the many who suffered under her leadership. The scandal that has plagued her administration has left a lasting stain on the town, one that may take years to heal. The legal challenges, the financial mismanagement, and the erosion of trust in local government have created a deep divide between the mayor and the people she once served. Whether Henyard's legacy will be defined by her scandals or by the community's ability to rebuild and restore trust remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. Her time as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, will be remembered as a tragic chapter in the town's history. Tiffany Henyard's time as mayor of Dalton, Illinois, has devolved into a deeply scandalous and chaotic period, leaving the community in disarray and distrust. What began with promises of change, progress, and reform soon spiraled into a cautionary tale of poor decision-making, financial mismanagement, and an utter disregard for accountability and transparency. Legal battles, allegations of corruption, and growing public backlash have threatened to unravel her leadership, tarnishing her legacy and leaving the people of Dalton questioning whether their mayor will ever be held accountable. One of the most notable legal challenges came from a lawsuit filed by a Dalton police officer who served as part of Henyard's personal security detail. The officer accused Henyard of misusing city resources to provide security for herself, raising serious concerns about financial stewardship and the misuse of taxpayer money. This lawsuit highlighted potential abuse of power, especially in the context of Dalton's fragile financial situation. It became a flashpoint, calling attention to Henyard's questionable priorities and her failure to uphold the trust of the residents she was meant to serve. The legal troubles for Henyard continued to mount. Another lawsuit was filed by Dwayne Doctor, a former maintenance manager, who alleged that he had been wrongfully terminated by Henyard. Doctor claimed the reasons for his termination were fabricated and cited violations of his First and 14th Amendment rights. These legal challenges added to a growing perception that Henyard was using her position to silence critics and political opponents, creating a toxic political environment. Critics accuse her of employing legal threats, terminations, and exclusions from key decisions to suppress dissent and eliminate those who pose a challenge to her authority. As the legal and ethical issues surrounding Henyard's administration deepened, federal investigators began to scrutinize her conduct. The investigation, led by former Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, focused primarily on Henyard's lavish spending, particularly her use of taxpayer funds for personal indulgences such as expensive meals, hotel stays, and extravagant travel. One of the most notorious examples of Henyard's financial mismanagement was a $26,000 trip to Las Vegas, funded by taxpayers, at a time when Dalton's finances were already in dire straits and many residents were struggling with economic hardship. This lavish expenditure raised serious concerns about Henyard's priorities and her ability to manage public resources effectively. In response to mounting criticism, Henyard attempted to frame the investigation as racially motivated. She argued that she was being unfairly targeted due to her identity as a black woman in power, claiming the investigation was an attempt to undermine her leadership. She invoked race as a shield to deflect attention from the real issues, her misuse of public funds, and failure to be accountable for her actions. However, many residents of Dalton saw this defense as a transparent attempt to avoid the consequences of her actions, further alienating her from the community. They felt her efforts to frame the investigation as racial were nothing more than an evasion of her responsibilities, as Mayor Henyard's growing disconnection from the community was further underscored by her absence from a Dalton Village Board of Trustees meeting, which only fueled suspicions and deepened the divide between her administration and the people she was supposed to serve. As the investigation into her financial mismanagement continued, more troubling revelations came to light. Federal investigators uncovered that nearly $900,000 had been paid to a local prosecutor over 2 years, despite the prosecutor's inability to generate any criminal charges. This raised significant questions about corruption within Henyard's administration and the misuse of public resources to benefit individuals close to her. As the federal investigation deepened, the scope of the corruption seemed to extend beyond Henyard herself. Authorities began to focus on her inner circle, including key figures like her deputy police chief, her political committee, her charity, and several trustees, 2 of whom were believed to be her relatives. Federal subpoenas were issued, demanding records related to payroll data, expenses, employment reimbursements, credit card statements, travel details, and other financial transactions. These subpoenas only deepened the cloud of suspicion surrounding Henyard's administration, amplifying concerns about potential corruption at the highest levels of local government. Amidst the growing legal pressure, Henyard's top aide, Keith Freeman, found himself at the center of the scandal. Freeman, who was facing bankruptcy fraud charges, was accused of failing to disclose Dalton's revenues and of receiving payments that exceeded the approved budget during his time in office. Despite these serious allegations, Freeman continued to hold influential positions both in Dalton and in Thoron Township, leading to speculation that his legal team might be negotiating with federal investigators for his cooperation in the ongoing probe. As the investigation progressed, former FBI agents speculated that additional evidence, informant, and witnesses might emerge, intensifying the scrutiny on Henyard and her associates throughout the investigation. Henyard maintained her innocence, dismissing the accusations as politically motivated and racially charged attacks designed to discredit her leadership. In a particularly inflammatory moment, she accused fellow trustees, many of whom were black, of being ashamed of themselves for attacking a black woman in a position of authority. This response, which focused on identity rather than addressing the substance of the allegations, only alienated the community further, emphasizing her growing disconnect from the very people she was meant to represent. The mounting evidence of Henyard's financial mismanagement added fuel to the growing calls for her accountability. One of the most glaring examples of her misuse of taxpayer money came to light when it was revealed that she had spent more than $12,000 on travel expenses in a single year, including first-class airfare and stays at luxurious hotels such as the Four Seasons in Atlanta and the Marriott Marquis in New York City. One of her hotel stays alone reportedly cost a staggering $133,000. This level of extravagance was especially egregious given Dalton's financial struggles, and many residents found Henyard's actions irresponsible and self-serving. Public funds that should have been used to improve the lives of Dalton residents were instead being used to indulge Henyard's personal preferences, further fueling a sense of betrayal among the very people who had once supported her promises of reform. As the investigation into Henyard's spending habits and questionable decisions continued, the pressure on her to step down intensified. Public calls for accountability grew louder, with Dalton residents demanding that their elected officials face the consequences of their actions and restore transparency to local government. The growing legal and ethical issues surrounding her administration cast a dark shadow over her leadership. While it remained unclear whether Henyard would face criminal charges, it was evident that her time as mayor was rapidly coming to an end. The people of Dalton, who had once supported Henyard's promises of reform and change, now found themselves grappling with the aftermath of her failures. The scandal that once seemed to promise a new era of leadership had instead exposed deep flaws in the town's governance. As the federal investigation unfolded, residents held on to hope that justice would eventually prevail and that the town could recover from the financial damage caused by Henyard's actions. The trust that had once been placed in her leadership was now completely shattered. The political crisis surrounding Henyard's leadership has underscored the importance of accountability and transparency in public office. Dalton's residents, who had hoped for progress and change under her leadership, now demanded a government that was responsible with taxpayer dollars and transparent in its actions. The investigation into Henyard's financial misconduct and corrupt practices is likely to continue to unfold, but one thing is certain: her political career has collapsed, and the trust she once held within the community has been irrevocably broken. The people of Dalton now long for a government that served them honestly and efficiently, with leaders who are held to the highest standards of public service.